In this video, I want to talk about liberal Christianity. I want to make a bit of a defense for liberal Christianity because most days I call myself a liberal Christian. Hard to even use the word because the small l, liberal word, still has a lot of negative connotations, but I'm going to talk about what it is, make a defense for it, argue that being a liberal Christian is a real, honest, genuine way to be a Christian, and for me, actually a much better way than more quote-unquote conservative ways of being Christians, which I have also tried. I was raised a fundamentalist evangelical, so I've been the spectrum, and I have come to see liberal Christianity as a really fantastic Christian tradition to be a part of. Now, the problem is liberal Christianity gets a bit of a bad rap, and I know from other channels I've watched, I know from books that have been written, a lot of people are really, really upset. People from, the more traditionalist camp are really upset that liberal Christianity even exists. I see people outraged over everything from like rainbow flags in front of churches to women in ministry. I was just watching a video the other day with all these dudes freaking out about a female Archbishop of Canterbury that the Anglican Church just elected. Sorry, Anglicans, forget the process. The thing is, a lot of people react to liberal Christianity, and the thing equally that I heard growing up is liberals are just wishy-washy. They just can't handle the truth. They're just not brave enough to actually stand up for what, for example, for what the gospel demands or for what the Bible says. And as a result, they're influenced by culture. We have that famous image in Daniel of the young men choosing to, stay pure for their beliefs. This is in Daniel chapter 1. And the idea that liberals have just been influenced by culture. I think in 2025, people would probably say liberals are woke, fill in the blanks, a lot of terrible things about liberal Christianity. And unfortunately, and not for the same reasons, but unfortunately, liberal churches are struggling. So I want to talk a little bit about what liberal Christianity is, why it's fantastic to be a part of, why it's a really honest and genuine way to be a Christian, and why fundamentalists don't get the last say on who liberals actually are. So let's start with a really basic kind of working definition. Like every definition, this one is problematic, but nevertheless, here it is. Liberal Christianity. Liberal Christianity developed in the 19th century out of the perceived need to adapt Christianity to a modern intellectual context. And with that came a recognition of kind of two big things. I'm really doing a really broad generic summary here, but there's kind of two big things that liberal Christianity incorporates. One is the need for human reason. One is that human reason is seen as being given by God in many cases. The fact that, that we're having all these scientific advances, which was happening at the end of the 19th century, and this belief that we need to reconcile those to faith, very different direction than what the fundamentalists I grew up around took, and that reason can be brought into the picture alongside of faith. One of my favorite Anglican thinkers, Richard Hooker, often is attributed with saying that reason needs to be brought in as part of the revelation of God. The other part of liberal Christianity, in sort of broad strokes, is that experience was seen to be a valuable part of Christianity, and therefore the experience of God in the world, the ongoing experience of people within the tradition, and how that can evolve and adapt to our modern experience. And it's not just an attempt to recreate an ossified past thing, but it's a living, breathing faith that can change and adapt and all that sort of thing. Those were kind of the two main pushes of liberal Christianity. So to break it down really simply, the way this looks in practice, I'm going to defend it in a minute, but first of all, the way this looks in practice is kind of, it often works out like this, just for some examples. Often liberal Christians don't believe in biblical inerrancy, for example. Now, biblical inerrancy was invented in the 19th and 20th centuries. Say more about that in a minute. I always do. But nevertheless, biblical inerrancy. Things like young earth creationism, liberals are known for not accepting this. Substitutionary atonement. This is a big one that the communities I grew up in thought that the gospel just meant Jesus died for my sins to take my place to prevent God's wrath for my sin. And often liberals don't necessarily see atonement in this way. I'm generalizing here, as I have to with any label like this, but exclusivism. This is one that we get a lot of flack for, that a lot of liberals see that Christianity isn't necessarily exclusive, that it's not necessarily the only path to God or the only path to truth. And finally, a lot of liberals are famously, or have been famously, skeptical of supernatural intervention into history. And this was famously the case with a lot of German scholars who started what in my field of biblical studies is called the historical critical movement. And part of this, not all of it, some of them believed in miracles, but a big part of it was often to attempt to come up with sort of reasonable or with an attempt to come up with sort of materialist explanations for history without necessarily including miracles. So these are things that liberal Christians often don't believe. Liberal Christians do believe often in a priority of Jesus' ethical teachings. Sometimes you'll see a high emphasis on the tradition in liberal churches, things like liturgy, things like ways of practicing Christianity as being put a little bit higher than certain doctrinal necessities that you might see in like more small c conservatives. Liberals often do emphasize this sort of adapting, evolving faith and are, typically have been known to change their mind on things like gay marriage or things like the ordination of women, sticking points that I think some of our more conservative brothers and sisters are coming along on now. Hate to say it, or I like to say it actually. So liberal Christians do emphasize an evolving understanding of faith and hopefully a lot of humility. So the first thing I want to defend is that liberals do follow true Christianity, or maybe I'd even say it this way. Liberal opponents don't follow true Christianity. Now, I'm not saying liberal opponents aren't Christians. I'm not saying liberals are or aren't Christians. What I'm saying is that a lot of the definitions get kind of murky. But here's an example. I've used this in other videos, but I think one of the problems that really helps to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about is that every single non-negotiable that I'm going to say a fundamentalist evangelical, these are not the only like opposition to liberals, but it's just where I came from. So when I was a fundamentalist evangelical, I thought, for example, non-negotiable, the Bible is the word of God. It speaks, we have to do what it says, and in it we understand God's voice. Now, that sounds really nice, and I've heard people throw that at liberals. Liberals don't take the Bible seriously. Liberals don't believe the Bible is the word of God. But what I would ask my former fundamentalist evangelical self is, where did that belief come from? Why do you believe that? And I couldn't have answered it. But what I know now, as a trained Bible scholar and having spent time in seminary, is that those are modern beliefs that were formed after this sort of historical critical movement that I mentioned a second ago in the 1800s. There was a pushback by American evangelicals, and they created this position towards the Bible that came up with the idea that the Bible was inerrant. Throughout history, the Bible had been called inspired. The Bible had occasionally been called infallible. Inerrancy was a specific modern belief, and that was invented in the 19th century, formalized in the 20th century. I grew up in the shadow of that belief. I took it for granted. I thought that was true Christianity, but I didn't know that my true Christianity was just a 20th century invention. You might say, well, a non-negotiable is that a Christian has to believe the Trinity, but the Trinity was formalized and yes, even invented in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The way that we understand the Trinity, people will always argue, Trinitarians will, I am one, but Trinitarians will argue, well, the roots were there before. Not very clearly. The Trinity was formulated in kind of Greek philosophy coming into contact with Jewish religious thought, and the Trinity was formulated as a way to understand what people would believe was a truth about God. But if you look, for example, I was recently in Ravenna, which was known as a capital of Arian Christianity, and for a long time there was probably thousands of people, and including this king in Ravenna, who followed this stream of Christianity, Arian Christianity, that believed that Jesus was created. Essentially, Jesus was the firstborn creation, or the first created thing or being from God. Now, Arians were later dismissed as heretics, and this is what led to the Council of Nicaea, which was a famous moment in the formulation of Trinitarian thought. But the question remains, are those people like what, burning in hell now because they had a slightly different understanding of Jesus? Hundreds of years of these groups who followed Jesus and had a Christian experience, Christian communities, all that sort of thing. I find that hard to argue. It seems pretty obvious to me that those people were just as earnest about their faith as I am in many cases, or as their Orthodox opponents were, or I should say proto-Orthodox. What about the non-negotiable that Jesus died for my sins and took my place on the cross, something that every worship song I ever learned seemed to sing about? Well, that's also got its stamp in history too. That came out of ideas like Augustine's idea of original sin, but then it was thinkers like Anselm of Canterbury in the 10th century, or Calvin or Luther, who came up with the specific ideas of penal substitutionary atonement. And if you look even in early Christianity, throughout the Christian tradition, there have always been different ways to understand what Jesus' death actually meant. And that includes things like the ransom theory, that Jesus died to buy us back from the powers of evil. There's a lot of different ways to understand what that death actually meant. So the problem is, and this is really important, The problem that people throw at liberals is that liberals are wishy-washy and refuse to stand up for the non-negotiables. But the thing that makes you a liberal is when you stop and realize that all of the things that people claim are negotiables are literally negotiable. They're literally formulated in history. They are a product of times and spaces and cultures, and very few people who proudly hold these non-negotiables, whatever they may be, very few people ever know where their non-negotiables come from. They couldn't actually defend them other than just as markers to show that they are in a community and like as these like identity markers to say like, yeah, I believe in the Trinity, but like how many of you could actually defend Trinitarian thought or actually understand why it emerged and what it means? Not very many people. Closest I ever got when I was a youth pastor was to say that the Trinity was like an egg, which had a white, a yolk, and a shell. 3 parts, 1 egg. Kind of pithy. The real issue here is that my former fundamentalist self came from a world where Christianity was simultaneously invented, but we also forgot that we had ever invented it. We thought we were just following true Christianity, but we were completely ignorant of where any of our ideas came from, and we were completely ignorant of where they were wrong. And because we didn't spend a lot of time thinking very critically about that, I knew people who studied the Bible their entire life and knew it inside and out, but had couldn't tell you the first thing about how it was put together, couldn't tell you about something simple like the synoptic problem that you would learn about in any first-year biblical studies course. This is the problem. The problem is that when you invent what you consider to be non-negotiables, you don't know where they come from, you think they're hills you have to die on, and by the way, you're going to persecute people for them. You're going to tell people that they can't be in leadership or can't be in your tradition or can't get married in your church or whatever, or have to submit to another gender, all because of these non-negotiables that you don't even know where they came from. That creates a problem for me. So in the face of the claim that liberals are abandoning tradition or abandoning truth or just, can't stand up for what's true because we're too woke and wishy-washy, I submit to you that the problem is that the truths that liberal opponents, or let me just say conservatives in this case, the truth that conservatives or the truth that I as an evangelical fundamentalist, the hill that I wanted to die on was not a hill worth dying on. So what happens when you understand that all your non-negotiables are historically conditioned? Hopefully you come to some sort of epistemological humility. I didn't make up this term. I've heard other people say it, but I like it. Epistemological humility. When you have a fundamentalist who says, I know 100% what God's will is, I know God speaks, he speaks to me, I understand what he's saying and what I need to tell you and all that sort of thing, that's not humility. That's a certain type of arrogance that comes with not actually ever questioning your hills that you think you have to die on. It's an arrogance that comes from never actually questioning that certainty. And when a liberal Christian says we acknowledge that we might have limits around human knowledge of the divine, for example, that's not a wishy-washy statement. That is a statement that very honestly assesses what we actually know and how much we actually can know about God. If you look at the historical evidence of Christianity, so often in history, orthodoxy came around through power, through subjugation, through oppressing dissenting views, and through imposing one view on another. And when you look at the church fathers, both those who are proto-orthodox and those who are later considered heretics, you genuinely do see people who are wrestling with a tradition and coming to different conclusions about the significance of any given thing, the Trinity or the absence of a Trinity. There were people actually wrestling with these questions. And when you can see that good Christians have come to different ideas about what it means to be a Christian, you can get some epistemological humility. And on the flip side, when you don't have any epistemological humility, you end up with the world that I grew up in the fundamentalist evangelical world, where we had very neat and tidy doctrines that we obsessed over, and they were stupid little things like will the rapture, the famous one around like the rapture, which in itself is an evangelical doctrine, but the idea that God, like Jesus, is going to come back and snatch people away. And then we would fight over things like, will there be a 7-year tribulation that the Christians have to be a part of, or will the Christians be snatched away and not have to be in this 7-year tribulation? These are the kinds of things that split churches. Does the grape juice need to be grape juice at communion, or does it have to be wine? Splits churches. Like, the most ridiculous things come from that fundamentalist evangelical world that I grew up in, because of a total lack of epistemological humility. The thing is, fundamentalists often mistake confidence for certainty. And liberal Christians, in my experience, often have the honesty to admit that we don't know what we don't know. So here's an example of something. If I look at the ordination of women, I can take the attitude of a fundamentalist and say, well, women, the Bible says women shouldn't be ordained. Okay. What does the Bible actually say about it? It says a little bit. If you look in the pastorals, you get a little bit. You get a little bit in the Pauline letters. Okay, so you get a little bit that suggests some limits on leadership of women in the church in certain places. But on the flip side, for example, you get things like the character of Junia in Romans, who is obviously a female and described as an apostle, which has bothered some people. You get 1 Corinthians 11, where it says if a woman prays or prophesies, she should have her head covered, which presumes that women should be praying and prophesying. These are things that tied people up in knots in the community that I came from. In the same way, we could understand, like, taking an even bigger, like, meta step further back, realizing that the Bible doesn't speak. We are always interpreting it. And the Bible as a sacred book was created. And I've done videos recently where we talked about the editing of the Bibles. I could talk about how the pastorals that have these verses that are often used to clobber women don't even appear anywhere before the end of the 2nd century. These are probably written in the late 2nd century, frankly. Like, they are not written by Paul, certainly. These are forged books. So you start to pull apart these meta layers of things that people so authoritatively state. And then somebody might fall back in the church fathers. The people who I grew up around didn't read the church fathers, but somebody might fall back and say, look, the church fathers are very reticent often about the role of women in worship. And then we might say, well, that's because literally some of the church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries thought that people shouldn't have sex. They thought that having any sex was a sin. And they thought that because women are often the people that it was primarily men doing this thinking, men wanted to have sex with women, that was an attraction, and therefore the women were bad and female sexuality was penalized. And anyways, you get all these layers. I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole. What do you get when you recognize that the Bible itself isn't really clear about the role of women? Even if you thought it was, those books that seem to be clear about the role of women are clearly later forgeries. They clearly reflect later ideas and probably don't actually reflect Jesus or even Paul. You start to pull apart these, and where do you land? You land on epistemological humility. You land on a place where you can say, I'm not going to oppress somebody else because an overly simplistic reading of the text. I'm actually going to recognize that there are a lot of things that I may not know. And if a woman comes in my community and says that she feels a call from God, that maybe that's worth listening to instead of just saying, oh, well, you're a woman, you can't. The thing is that when you are certain about the world, when you're certain you have absolute truth, you can justify almost any cruelty with it. You can use that truth to, instead of asking if there were problems in the 3rd, 4th century church with gender, instead of asking if there are gender difficulties there, you just prescribe that as normative and take that 3rd, 4th century, maybe it's a sin. Maybe it's a sin that women are being marginalized in the 3rd, 4th centuries. And you just say, no, we just need to recreate this because that's the authority. When you're certain you have absolute truth, you can use this to justify cruelty. But when you admit uncertainty, you fall back on a tradition that requires more grace. It requires more love. It requires more patience with each other and the ability to live recognizing that we have differences that we can't necessarily always understand in how we understand our own tradition. The third reason why liberal Christianity for me has been a godsend is because liberal Christianity has given me a way to remain in a tradition but actually use my brain. And on this channel, I've done so many videos talking about apologetics. And at their core, the reason apologetics to me are so horrendous is that apologists are always starting with their own presuppositions and working backwards to try to find the reason to justify it, to try to find the evidence for it. And this is, in a secular sense, this is terrible for scholarship. It's just a terrible way to produce knowledge. But even in a faith sense, it's really terrible to start with presuppositions and work backwards for faith as well. Like if that's what your faith is based on, that I'm looking for the evidence that keeps me from ever having to change my mind, from ever having my ideas challenged, that's just, to me, a really pathetic type of faith. And I've done a lot of things where I talk about how apologists will play intelligence, how apologists will perform a type of intellectualism while being actually very intellectually lazy and really not doing a lot of good intellectual work or not actually engaging with real scholarship. I can't go too far down this in this video either, but I've done some other videos on this. I'll link to this one right here. I mean, there are obviously some super, super smart people who choose to be apologists. But when somebody like William Lane Craig, for example, who has exceptionally good credentials, turns around and feels the need to justify the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Old Testament, I have to ask myself, is that William Lane Craig, the intellectual, justifying the slaughter of the Canaanites when he says, yeah, God can kill Canaanite children if God chooses to? Or is that William Lane Craig, the apologist? I would prefer to look at that and say, that doesn't really seem to square that God would slaughter Canaanite children. It doesn't really seem to square, at least the way that we understand a God of love. There's obviously a tension there. And rather than trying to explain why it's okay, or rather than starting with the belief that the Bible must have no errors and therefore I have to come up with reasons why it's okay to slaughter Canaanite children, isn't it a lot more satisfying to actually engage intellectually with this and say, maybe the Bible's wrong. Maybe people I'm not a theologian, but maybe people had the wrong understanding of God and what God wanted in that circumstance. Maybe those Canaanite children deserved a little bit of dignity and maybe a chance to live their life. Anyway, these are big ethical questions I'm not going to get into right now. But in my own field, I see this all the time because I see apologetics leads people to bad biblical scholarship. Why? Because there's this modern idea, coming back to what I already said, the Bible is the inerrant word of God. This is a statement that you will find in evangelical universities. You'll find it in churches' statements of faith. You will find this as the box that for some people leads any question that they ever have about the Bible. And when you're going with a modern presupposition that the Bible has to be inerrant, you don't know where it came from, you just believe it's inerrant, you believe it speaks to you, which it doesn't, by the way, it always requires interpretation. But nevertheless, real scholarship requires honesty. And I find that being a liberal Christian allows me to have that honesty. There's another corollary to this too, I should add, that's kind of funny, is that I'm often called a skeptic. I get thrown the word in comments that you're a skeptic. As a liberal Christian, often you're seen as a skeptic. They say liberals are too skeptical. But it's funny that when I look at somebody who is skeptical, I look at people who are skeptical about evolution, skeptical about historical criticism, skeptical about biblical scholarship and what my discipline comes up with all the time. Hyper skeptical. So here's what happens. Liberal Christians are accused of not taking the Bible seriously. I would argue that liberal Christians often take the Bible more seriously. I don't start with pre-existing conclusions about it and go and try to justify my evidence. I actually look at the text and try to actually engage with the text, actually understand what it's saying, actually understand what the evidence is showing me. To me, this is taking the Bible seriously. When you just start with a 20th century, 21st century assumption about the Bible, you stir in a little bit of narcissism and you think this just needs to speak to me, and you just read right past any of the ancient readers or any of the intended intentions of the text itself, the intended audience, and you just try to figure out what God is saying to you. That's not taking the Bible seriously. Taking the Bible seriously is actually trying to understand the world that formed it, trying to actually understand where it came from, the reasons it was put together, and actually engaging with it thoughtfully and critically as not only a text of faith, but also as a historical text. The thing is, liberals don't take the Bible less seriously than, say, fundamentalists. I think often liberals take the Bible more seriously because they refuse to just read 21st century assumptions onto first, second, maybe third, probably second century texts. That seems to be taking the Bible serious to me. The other outcome is that liberal Christianity creates healthier communities. Now, liberal churches are struggling. There's a note here that I'm not going to talk too much about, but a lot of liberal churches are struggling. But the thing is, I see, having lived in fundamentalist evangelical communities my whole life, I see the cracks showing in those types of communities as well. Often these are communities that focus on the need to indoctrinate children, the need to tell children they are wicked, sick, evil creatures, bound for hell. Maybe they're going to be raptured. Maybe their sexuality is evil and needs to be repressed. Maybe, God forbid, they're gay and then that needs to be repressed. Even just heterosexual sexuality is often repressed. You get true love waits rings and all this kind of crap, purity pledges. You amp in a little bit of homeschooling because we're too scared to let anybody else tell you what to think other than us. And all of a sudden, you have kids growing up in a really unhealthy community. And if you really want to know what, this is a sidebar, but if you want to know what the deconstructionist movement is, I think fundamentally the deconstructionist movement is, in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, it is Christian kids, evangelical fundamentalist kids coming to term with their abusers. It's evangelical fundamentalist kids coming to term with their abusers. I was told I would disappear. I often thought my family would disappear. I was told I was wicked and sinful. I was told all of these things. And if you were raised in an environment like this, even in the absence of actual like abuse of some sort, this is some pretty seriously emotionally, spiritually abusive crap that we had to deal with. So you start with this attitude towards kids, and then you amp up the guilt, you amp up the sin and the shame, and you amp up this idea that you are going to burn in hell unless you cry out to God for help. You amp up this idea that people need to be weak, they need to be sinful, they need to be frail, they need to feel bad about themselves. And like, look at the average modern worship song. It's this narcissistic cocktail that will say something along the lines of, I'm so evil, I'm so terrible, but you're so good because you love me, something like that. I just made that one up. But this is fundamentally a community that's based often in manipulation. It's often based on guilt. It's often based on this attempt to like manufacture this certainty, and apologetics comes in there too. And so does male leadership that often can't be questioned. And all of these things, you get this like toxic stew of communities that really hurt people. And often to work, these communities need to expel people. They need to expel maybe LGBTQ people. Maybe they need to keep women in their place. Maybe they need to keep women subservient to their husbands or as helpmates. Maybe they have a pastor who's a bully and you can never ask any questions of him. The problem is, this is not always fundamentally a healthy community. Now, I'm not saying there aren't fundamentally healthy Catholic communities, evangelical communities, whatever. There are healthy faith communities, of course. But I think that liberal Christianity has the potential, we're not always living up to it, but I do think we have the potential to create beautiful, healthy communities because we don't make believing the right things necessarily in the same way a condition of belonging. You can belong to communities. And when you have a community that you can just belong to without having anxiety about whether or not you believe the right things or doing the right things or thinking the right things, that is a much healthier community. And by the way, when you can use your brain to explore, ask all sorts of hard questions, form a relationship with a tradition that doesn't just require some sort of like thought police in your head, as Christopher Hitchens famously said about this like totalitarian regime in your head watching your thoughts. That's a way to get to healthy communities. We're not always there. We've missed the boat. Liberal Christians have missed the boat in many, many ways, in part because I think we have forgotten how to create gravitas and make for a serious religious experience or serious thoughtful religion. And often we get too caught up in just being nice to each other or echoing the political, kind of political climates. I think I'm not American, but often with American Christians, it feels like you can choose to be either Republican Christian or Democrat Christian. And the truth is, I don't really want to be either of those two things. So I do think liberal Christianity has some potential to create amazing communities, but I do think it's something we need to keep getting better at. But as I said, there are lots of great liberal communities out there as well. So when you look at liberal Christianity, what do you get? You get a movement that is historically informed. You get a movement that's epistemologically humble. You get a movement that's intellectually rigorous. You get a movement that is serious about the Bible. Yes, we are. You get a movement that is also serious about ethics, not just because believing that some ancient book just tells us what to do and we have to recreate it without asking, but we actually have to think seriously about ethical questions and actually engage and actually ask the difficult questions and work out ethics in our own lives and in our own communities. So if being historically accurate, intellectually honest, academically rigorous, what else did I say? Biblically serious and serious about ethics, if that sounds wishy-washy to you, like people say, oh, this is wishy-washy. Like when I hear that, I'm like, that's not wishy-washy. That is the basis of a fantastic human religious experience. And that's why I really love being a liberal Christian. Now, I don't care if you're a liberal Christian at the end of the day. I don't care if you want to leave Christianity, if you want to be an atheist, that's fine. But when I talk about experiencing a Christianity that lets you ask questions, lets you be honest, lets you belong without necessarily being subject to endless belief tests, a lot of people say, like, where does that even happen? I don't even know that exists. Because a lot of people who are raised in the communities I was raised in skip right past liberal Christianity on their way to atheism, because I think that's just the next stop. that fundamentally, if you aren't going to be extreme, if you aren't going to be a fundamentalist, or if you aren't going to be, slightly more open, conservative of some sort, you just need to go to atheism. And the truth is, liberal Christianity is a fantastic option for those of us who want to retain connection to the community, ask hard questions, be intellectually honest, but at the end of the day, still be a Christian. But participating in this tradition, I think I could sum it up with one word. It just comes down to freedom. And freedom is a wonderful thing. I never felt free when I was a fundamentalist evangelical. I didn't realize that until I left. But the description of freedom that people used to tell me about, that when they converted to fundamentalist evangelicalism, I felt that freedom when I went the other way. I felt that freedom when I felt these chains come off my brain and my soul, and I could just explore the world of faith, explore this way of being Christian, explore the Bible, explore all these things without these chains on my mind and soul. That was an amazing thing. I hope this was a helpful starting off point as a bit of a introduction to why I think liberal Christianity, it gets a bad rap, but also deserves a lot more respect than we tend to get. There are so many wonderful liberal Christian thinkers. I will link to some of them below, link to some books and resources. If you're in a liberal tradition, I think you can hold your head up high. We have a lot to be proud of, honestly, even though we have a lot of work to do to keep building communities and keep growing the movement of liberal Christianity. There's still a lot to be done. But I think, honestly, when people find this, it's a really awesome place to be. And if you know what I'm talking about, if you never tried it, look up a liberal church in your area if you need to. Check out some local community. Go find a place where you can explore this tradition free of intellectual shackles and just get to experience and explore it. Thank you so much. As always, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, take a second and subscribe. I talk a lot more about biblical scholarship in general than I did today, but this was just some reflections on liberal Christianity. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. See you next time.